All right, Todd, for new bettors, what's the sucker bet that they should stay away from? Is it MVPs? Is it Super Bowl champion odds? What would you recommend us kind of shying away from at this point right now in the offseason?
Very, very excited to welcome into the pod. He's an old friend. He is an old podcast co-host back when we knew what the heck we were doing. Not that we know what we're doing now. And he's made it big. I feel like Mr. Todd Fuhrman, you were, before we started talking about gambling, this was a space that you put your flag in and you said, I'm going to do this thing. Even if people didn't want to talk about it, people were scared to talk about it. So first and foremost, welcome to the podcast. How's everything going with you, man? It's been too long.
Well, thank you first and foremost, guys, for having me. And I guess the first question, Adam, is TalkShoe still a thing? I mean, do people use the podcast platform that we used almost a decade ago to try and churn out college football gambling podcasts before they were the in vogue cool thing to do?
I remember calling in with the cell phones, right? And I remember the audio quality being terrible. And I remember we didn't think anyone listened. I'm still not sure anyone listened. But then people were mad when we stopped doing it. So, who knows? But in any event, Todd, again, thank you so much for joining us. Let's go back before we talk about what you're doing now and really how you got your start. You and I have talked about this over alcoholic milkshakes before, but where did you get your start? How did you tap into this gambling world?
Yeah, it was kind of the path less traveled. I mean, I got the itch at a real young age, probably a lot earlier than most, should be in and around point spreads. And I have my dad to thank for that. He was always around the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and had that gambling DNA that he passed down to me. So when I was younger, we used to go to hockey practice early in the morning in the Chicago suburbs. He'd flip me the Chicago Tribune or the Sun-Times, and I'd go through alternating games, picking every NFL game against the spread. I think we were betting $1 a game back then, which might be enough to get me a cornbread muffin at Dunkin' Donuts if I had a good Sunday the week before. Or if things really went well, I could probably get 20 to 50 Munchkins, donut holes, whatever you want to call them, to reap the benefits there. And that's where it kind of fostered my interest in this space. I'd always been in and around sports as an athlete and kind of watching games. Of course, you didn't have the influx of options on TV back then like you do now. And then as I got older, it became more, how do I turn a passion and a pet project, so to speak, into a professional pursuit? Went to school for my degree in international economics, thought for all intents and purposes that, hey, I was going to be on that path to Wall Street. I was going to be in the investment associate program. I was going to work my 100 hours a week and try and figure out what to do with the rest of my life after I served my time for one of those big brokerage houses. And honestly, guys, I mean, I woke up towards the end of my senior year at Wesleyan and went, what the hell am I doing with my life? I don't think this is what I want to do. I'm not sure Manhattan's necessarily for me. Went home, bartended, waited tables in the Chicago suburbs and tried to figure out what the hell I was going to do with the rest of my life. And as luck would kind of have it, a fortuitous bounce or two took me out to Las Vegas, where I started in the casino business as a financial analyst and worked my way up through that organization and had a number of people in the race and sports side that took a liking to me as I crunched numbers. My mentor in the business, Chuck Esposito, had always taken the time to answer all of the stupid questions that I would fire at him about the machinations of moving numbers, how future markets work, and learn some of those philosophies to the point we're at now, where if you'd have told me when I got out to Vegas at 24, 25, that sports gambling would take off in such a way, I'd have gone, where do I sign on the dotted line? And probably would have thought you guys were nuts. But then again, life has a funny way of working itself out, and thankful for the opportunities I've been given and the great people I've met along the way, including yourself, Adam.
Oh, thank you. You're lying, but thank you.
Todd, I got a question for you. Let's get into the nitty gritty. How does an NFL line come together? How do odds makers create these lines that we love to lose money on?
Yeah, Marcus, it's a great question. And when you look at how the entire betting market establishes its identity, it's off of a baseline power number. I know it's an oversimplified approach because every odds maker has unique variables that they want to try and include in building their power numbers. But when you look at the NFL schedule, that's what allows odds makers to not only put out week one lines once the schedule gets released, but within 48 to 72 hours, put out lines for every single regular season game. And of course, we know personnel is going to change from now until the start of the season. Stocks go up and down in the National Football League based on each data point that we have, but it's a combination of personnel and figuring out player ratings, looking at some of the advanced metrics. And the NFL, maybe more so than any of the other four major sports out there, includes a component of public perception. So for folks that always want to try and go, well, I'm going to build my power numbers off the NFL futures, I tell them to pump the brakes, because the futures are going to reflect a lot of public bias and where books can get liability, whereas win totals are going to be a much more accurate reflection of how odds makers truly view the teams and what their season-long outlooks look like based on that strength of schedule. But at the same time, I mean, you can see a team that's power rated inside the top 10 have a lower win total than a team power rated, 18 to 20. And that's a byproduct of the opponents that they're going to face over the course of 18 weeks.
So for you, Todd, as someone who I know you don't just talk about this, you have to put your opinions out there like we all do regularly. And you were one of the first to do it. But let's look at the NFL season. We've got futures, we've got props, you've got the draft, and now you've got this, what we think is clarity of an NFL season with week one lines and all sorts of unique things that we can do now, even with the carousel of quarterbacks and all those. When are you looking to pounce? Have you pounced? Are you waiting for more information? Like, what does your offseason timeline look like from a betting standpoint when it comes to the NFL?
With one of the things as it pertains to the NFL futures, and this is going to be a boring economics lesson for a lot of folks that are out there. I mean, as a sports bettor, you all have limited resources. So when you talk about that being the case, it really becomes the cost of capital. And do you want to tie up your money in an NFL future, odds to win the Super Bowl if you're doing this day in, day out, 300 plus days before they're going to crown a champion, unless you have a truly quantifiable massive edge. Because if you're betting a baseball game or a hockey game, a 3 to 4% edge on a daily basis, you have no qualms about trying to fire into that betting market. But if the same situation holds true for the NFL, you have to be a little bit more cautious as you look at some of the big picture things. So for me, I have not invested in a single win total or NFL future yet. I do take that back. I have a small investment on the Washington football team way back when the future odds came out to win the NFC. So I was able to gobble them up at about plus 375 or 4-1. But to be honest, it's not a bet that I love right now when you look at the layout of their schedule, because I think that price is going to present itself if they get out of the gate slowly. And for example, that team, I believe 5 of their last 6 games are all within the division. So you may be able to go for a 6-week sprint there, but that's the only future I have. And it is a small bet. Win totals, I'll do a lot more work now over the next 6 to 8 weeks and try and figure out where there's an opportunity to make an investment there. Yes, no's, and odds to make the playoffs. But my bankroll, especially as it pertains to the NFL, is still largely intact. And I have not overextended myself on any of the future markets, but haven't also really taken a look at the individual awards, coach of the year, rookie of the year, those sort of things. That's a project that I have on my plate in the next couple of weeks.
All right, Todd, for new bettors, what's the sucker bet that they should stay away from? Is it MVPs? Is it Super Bowl champion odds? What would you recommend us kind of shying away from at this point right now in the offseason?
Betting the Bears to win the Super Bowl because Fields is going to be the man to take them to the promised land. No, all kidding aside, when you look at the futures market for the NFL, I tell folks, if you're going to invest this far out, try to identify those long shots. Because a price like Kansas City at 4-1 or even Buffalo in that 10 to 12 range, there's a very good chance you're going to be able to get those same prices in August, maybe even September, especially with Kansas City, who their toughest stretch of the schedule comes over the first 5 to 6 weeks. So if you're looking at some of those markets, I tell people all the time that if you're going to do this, even as a recreational bettor, and you have a limited amount of resources, don't overextend yourself in the futures market. Try and put, 20 to 25% there, have a little bit of fun with it, because that's what sports gambling is for the majority of people. It's entertainment, and you want to put up a little bit to win a lot, but there's no sense running to bet some of those particular prices unless you feel that it can't miss territory. I mean, guys, we could all believe that Trevor Lawrence is going to be the front runner to win the offensive rookie of the year, but at 2-1 or 5-2, there's no reason to tie up your cash now over the next 17 to 18 weeks until, of course, we know Tim Tebow makes the roster and then the Jaguars officially become God's team.
God, don't even get me started, Todd. When it comes to the NFL and the quote unquote sharp bettors, and you talk a lot about kind of the average bettor and their hold and how to manage it. What does the offseason look like for them other than betting on other sports, right? I know this is not a group that's necessarily just stuck to the NFL, but for the really intelligent bettors out there that are looking for value, do they share your opinion where they're not necessarily investing in these things largely? Are there individuals out there who say, hey, this is my best chance to get it, and so, hey, I'm going to push these limits as far as I can? Are they gathering research? Again, take us kind of behind the curtain for the sharp better and how they spend their NFL offseason.
Yeah, that's one of the great parts about this space, Adam, is that every bettor doesn't ascribe to the same theory. So when you talk about folks that bet the NFL, there are a group contingent that spend 365 days a year focusing entirely on the NFL. And they cherish their downtime, whether it's in January and February, when the regular season is wrapped up and they've done a lot of their damage there. And they're trying to go through rosters and personnel that gauge turnover and anticipate, hey, look, this team may or may not be undervalued or overvalued. And to be honest, this day and age, exploring metrics that may not be out there for public consumption. I mean, we try and cover a lot of those on our Bet the Board podcast when we break stuff down, have a chance to talk to some of the sharpest guys that are out there. And some of the metrics that are there aren't always available for general consumption. I mean, I think back to years when we used to talk about college football games. I mean, nobody was discussing net yards per play or game control. And I think professional bettors will learn those things first. They'll try and apply them to their handicapping process. And then a lot of those facts and figures become more generally accepted. So there's no one way to skin a cat when you talk to trying to about making money in the National Football League. Those folks with deeper pockets can tie up a lot more of their capital further out. But at the same time, also keep in mind that you're not going to get the same kind of limits extended on a win total if you're betting it in the middle of May as if you're betting it in early August when books feel a lot more comfortable with their numbers.
All right, Todd, what's some tips and some advice that you can give to young bettors? Because there's a lot of people out there that have no idea what net yards per play even means or why that matters. So give us some tips for the young ones.
Don't worry, Mark.
And when you say young bettors, you're like, I'm listening here too.
Yeah, well, okay? we all learn.
It's a big net. It's a big net.
Don't worry, Adam. I'm sure is trying to Google that term right now so he can use it in a more educated fashion. The biggest thing that I tell bettors out there, especially as we see legalized sports betting getting into all the nooks and crannies and different jurisdictions, only bet money you can afford to lose. And while that sounds like a defeatist mentality, it really allows you to enjoy the experience of betting college football or the NFL, baseball, whatever sports that you want to follow. We all can afford to make more money, but it's a question of what you can allocate, whether it's $100, whether it's $500, $1,000, what have you. The same way I tell people, when you go out on the golf course, you're not doing this to try and make money. You're trying to go out there, enjoy yourself for a couple of hours, and it becomes a form of recreation. And sports betting should honestly be viewed through a very similar lens. I'd say 1.5% to 2% absolute max for people that are betting sports or turning a profit year over year on this. And we, of course, all can catch lightning in a bottle. We can have that one season where we're hitting the 58 to 60%. And we think that, hey, look, we figured out the secret sauce. But the regression monsters are always evident. And for every 60% season that a recreational bettor will have, you'd be amazed how quickly they come back crashing back to earth because they bet more aggressively. And then suddenly 42% the following season when all those close games and those made or missed field goals don't happen to go your way. So that would be the number one piece of advice. And for people out there that have limited hours, I mean, the NFL makes a great sport because it's only once a week. But keep in mind that it's not necessarily a 50-50 proposition like you're led to believe when you're doing this. Guys are out there trying to manipulate the market, take full advantage of it. And sometimes just focusing on a handful of teams may give you a little bit more of a head start in one of the sport's most efficient markets.
I have a neighbor that's going through this right now with UFC. Really, Illinois legalizes sports betting. That's his avenue in. Got really hot betting UFC for like about a month and was really hot and started kind of peacocking about it. And Todd, I said the same thing, like just text like, hey, enjoy it. But you will feel the other side of this. And sure enough, boom, 2 weeks in a row. Like that's the way it goes. And that's really good advice.
The crazy part about it. I mean, for anybody that's been in a workplace environment, you hear the same guys, oh yeah, how'd you do this weekend betting games? Well, I won. It's amazing how many people show up to work on Monday when they haven't had a losing week betting football for the last 12 years. If those guys truly have a secret sauce, you figured, them, their wives, their girlfriends would all be spending a lot more time in the Turks and Caicos than they would be in the Chicago suburbs when those temperatures dip below freezing.
Todd, you have been around this. I mean, seriously, like we did that college football podcast before we knew what the hell we were doing or why we were doing it. And you've kind of truly been a pioneer here. And now you're seeing sports gambling explode and also the coverage of it change. What is your opinion of how it's exploded, how it's being covered? It's so different now than it was when you started doing this, and you're popping up on ESPN 1000 locally, which was like rebellious at the time when they're asking you to pick games against the spread. So how do you think this thing has evolved in maybe a good and bad?
I think it's good that it's getting more mainstream coverage. I mean, we knew sports betting was going on all across the country for years. And the fact that people had to kind of hide their behavior felt, counterintuitive to me, especially the level of hypocrisy we saw from professional sports and collegiate sports to some extent, knowing that gambling was essentially the primary driver in their popularity. That's what forced more people to watch games, whether it was fantasy, DFS, you name it, and why they can get such lucrative television contracts. Sure, college football fans are all over the place, but the reason the SEC deal is worth as much as it is because folks, yes, they have their allegiances, but trust me, even though sports betting isn't legal down throughout the Alabama, Mississippi corridor, at least in some spots, I should say more Alabama, obviously than Mississippi, there are plenty of folks throughout Birmingham. If you go to a sports bar on a college football Saturday, that may or may not have a vested interest in games that just don't include Alabama and Auburn. But the one troubling part, Adam, I see with the way things are going is that everybody kind of masquerades as experts. And that's the one fear, that responsible gaming gets ushered aside. And, people talk about circulating, 10 to 12 team parlays. I'll be honest, guys, I've never hit a 10 team parlay in my entire life. I've probably only bet 4 or 5. But if you look on social media, these things hit 72% of the time. I mean, if you go through Twitter or you go through Instagram and see people putting up $5 to make a lot, it's essentially a sports lottery ticket. So I'd like to see, personalities and a lot of the operators show a little bit more attention to some of the responsible gaming component, because while 95 to 90%, 97% of us enjoy this as a form of recreation or, my case, an occupation, there are 2 to 3% of folks out there, maybe a shade higher, haven't looked at the numbers, that can't do this in a responsible manner. And I've unfortunately been around problem gamblers, both on this side of the counter and when I worked at Caesars. And when you read the horror stories and how it can rip apart families, it's the darker side. So you just like people to understand what they're getting themselves into. And at the same time, everyone feels like they have to be a generalist and understand every sport. If people want to ask my opinion on UFC, I'm going to tell them, quite frankly, flip a coin. I mean, it's not a sport where I feel comfortable breaking it down. You want to talk college football, you want to talk the NHL, the NFL. Hey, look, I'm more than happy to offer an informed opinion. But at the same time, too, the one thing I've seen, guys, is people talk about, I'm winning, 75% of my bets. Well, anyone who's winning 75% of their bets isn't telling you the whole story. I mean, we grind in this business to win 55 to 57%, and that's a tremendous year. So always buyer beware if people are promising delusions of grandeur and ridiculous win percentage that just aren't sustainable if you're betting into a traditional market.
Todd, what's the next step for gambling and broadcast? Do you think we'll see like live lines in an NFL or college game like we're seeing in DraftKings, or excuse me, in UFC right now through DraftKings? Do you think we're going to see, a gambling host in the broadcast? What are your expectations going forward?
Yeah, I do think that's kind of the next iteration, Marcus. When you look at the kind of blending of both a sports telecast and the gambling lines, we've seen a couple of entities. ESPN, I know, has been pretty aggressive with BetCast. We've seen a little bit of that, I believe, with the NBA. And I think it's a good way for a second screen viewing. We haven't exactly seen, Troy Aikman and Joe Buck talking about live lines when they return from break, but I do think it's an education process. You have to allow, all the TV personalities, whether they're the color guys or the play-by-play folks, to understand and talk about it in a somewhat educated discourse, because I don't think the public's ready to get hit over the head with a mallet with this, and they don't want to feel that it's constantly in their face like the DFS push that created that government crackdown years ago. So you have to treat it as a field position game. How do you seamlessly weave it into the dialogue? And whether it's a 2-minute segment here or an updated halftime, I have to give some of the various, regionalized broadcasts, whether it's Bally Sports and, some of the MSG platforms, they'll show odds in between periods of hockey games with some of their preferred partners. And I think it's a good way to kind of expose people to some of the terminology, make them understand what's out there, and allow their comfort level to grow. because the reality of sports betting is going to take off. Like I think we all believe, it just doesn't have to be centered around that 21 to 45-year-old male demo with discretionary income. You want to make it less intimidating. You want to lower the barriers of entry and allow folks that are betting 500 to 5,000 to enjoy it on the same level.
So before we let you go, I know you're a big hockey guy. We've got playoffs coming up. NBA, you sit on any interesting futures right now? I know NFL, you're kind of waiting for a little bit. You got any interesting tickets that you're hoping to cash?
You know what? When it comes to the NHL, I mean, you look, and we've only seen a couple games in these series. Tampa has really surprised me. I'm not sure I thought they would hit the ground running, getting some of their key cogs back, but the value in that number is not quite there. You know, I think if you're looking down the board and obviously shop around for the best number, a team that I'm high on, although they haven't quite played to their potential and they could easily get knocked out in the first round, still with a lot of work in front of them, would be the Boston Bruins. I think when you look at what they did at the trade deadline, you go out and you get a player like Taylor Hall, who had underachieved for Buffalo, but we know this guy's a couple of years removed from being a league MVP. You have a proven goalie in Tuukka Rask. And while you may not love Coach Cassidy and what some of the decisions he makes in game, I think they can get out of the East. And if you're holding a ticket at like 12-1, as long as you can avoid the likes of maybe Colorado, Tampa, or Carolina, potentially in the Final Four, hey, weirder things have happened. A goalie gets hot and you'll have a chance to earn off of that ticket. So Boston, probably the best thing going out there. And maybe, Adam, if you want to get into college football, is this the year the Georgia Bulldogs finally get over the hump? Should we be drinking the Kool-Aid now? I mean, I know they're going to be short underdogs against Clemson, but that hype train is going to officially leave the station if they win that game outright.
Of course. How are we going to do this again though? Like we are going to do this again is what we're going to do. Yeah. If not this year, then when, right? Because Alabama, that's a fresh group, man. That is a fresh and experienced group. Bryce Young will be very good. Georgia is the most talented team in the country by a wide margin. So am I ready to jump on them as a short dog? I probably am, but I know better, Todd, and you know better too, right? We know what happens.
What do they say that insanity is loosely defined as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results? Yes. I feel like that's been the case when it comes to betting Georgia to win the national championship in college football since Kirby took over down there in Athens.
I am so excited though. Just seeing games scheduled there gets me pumped up. Todd, before we get you out of here, tell us where we could find you. You're on TV. You've got a legitimate podcast now that you're not calling in on the phone with like we used to do back in the day. So where can we find you and check all your work?
Yeah, modern technology's gotten a little bit better to record podcasts. If only we knew that back in the day, we could have microphones and all of those fancy stuff. And Drew would be trying to merge audio files for about 16 hours a day as the four of us talk over each other. You mentioned the podcast, Bet the Board podcast, more football centric than anything else. We will have our off-season edition, hopefully, as we get into June, talking about some of the moves and where the opening numbers are before we get into the deep dives going into college and pro football. But once we get rolling in the fall, 3 times a week, Mondays and Thursdays for the pros, Wednesdays for college football. You can see us on Fox Bet Live Monday through Friday, Fox Sports 1, 2 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Central, 5 o'clock on the East Coast. Breaking games down. It's a little bit more surface level is the nicest way to put it for the banter and everything we have going on there. And if you check out CBS HQ, I'm on there periodically as well, breaking down games. But this is kind of the calm before the storm. It's time to cultivate those power numbers that we talked about. When August 1st rolls around, that's when you start burning the candle at both ends in this business.
I'm not just saying this because I've known you a long time, but the best in the business, man. Truly, your success was predictable. You're doing a killer job. We really appreciate you jumping on here, man. And hopefully we could talk.
Hey, appreciate the kind words and best of luck and good luck trying to fine tune some of those numbers. We know football will be here before we know it.
Amen. Todd Fuhrman, thanks again.